It is really a pleasure to introduce Karen Hawley-Miles, the Executive Director of ERS, Education Resources Strategies, and she's going to both moderate and lead this panel. Karen.
All right. This is the most desired speaking point, right? After your creme de caramel, whatever it was. So if you need to stand up and stretch, feel free as we go along. But we're really excited to be here. What I want to do first, and then I'm going to, I want to, this is a big moment for ELT. And all morning we've been learning about how much momentum there is, how we have emerging insights about the results and so on, but it's also a tenuous moment for ELT. We've got the SIG funds declining, we have a lot of uncertainty around federal funding and state funding, and we have continued pressure on the cost structures in urban districts where costs continue to rise pretty much automatically to fund legacy structures that have existed since the industrial age. And we have all these new things that we want to do in our schools as we're learning about what needs to happen and as we're trying to raise standards for all kids. And we work across the country with urban districts and schools that are trying to figure out new ways of doing things so that every child can learn in every school. And I'll give you the example of Orchard Gardens, which is a very famous school. Obama came there. Duval Patrick has been there numerous times. They have extraordinary results as a result of some wonderful leadership they have had and significant infusion of state, district, and federal funds around the SIG program. A critical part of that work, along with many other things, has been extending the time. And one of the things they brought us in to do, just as the funds were, as they were looking ahead to the funds leaving, is to ask this question: how could they fund this sustainably going forward? When we took a look at it, we did find all sorts of ways in which they could fund it. But the key insight, and I think this is important for us to think about, the key insight was that I figured out a way where, and the team figured out a way where they could free the resources like this. And that was to become a charter school. As soon as they became a charter school, they were able, they had a whole different playing field on which to operate, and they could have gotten that extra time without the additional resources. The loss there, though, is that as soon as we have schools opting out of the system, we don't have the opportunity to scale what we're trying to do across all kids and make sure that every child has access to all of these things. Furthermore, the evidence is out whether they can sustain the sort of cost structures that they're creating. So what I want to put out in front here is that the key to sustaining ELT work across the country, expanded learning time work, will be to figure out how to incorporate it into the regular cost structures that exist and into the regular funding streams that exist. And what I would argue today, and what our research in this group is here to tell you, is that that's going to require some very big shifts. It's going to require not, as one of the panelists early this morning was saying, it's not about adding this on top. It's about reconceptualizing how we're doing everything and what the basic cost structures are and patterns of operating in schools are that make that happen. So we're going to be sharing some research, and then we have folks who have all actually participated in helping with this research at various levels, and also trying to get this work to happen in different all over the country in different districts. So I want to introduce them to you and then set it up a little bit in terms of what we tried to study. So first, we have this lovely picture of David Farbman. He is a senior researcher at the National Center on Time and Learning. He writes a blog called Time Matters, and I'm sure if you're in this field, you've read lots of what he's written and the research that they have done as an organization. Next, we have Nisha Garg. She is one of the authors of the study that we'll be sharing with you today. and has worked really deeply with citizen schools and this expert panel and try to get this message right. Then we have David Liebowitz, who is a principal at the Browne Middle School, and he'll be sharing how he's made this happen. And then last but certainly not least is Marianne Schmitt-Carey, who's president of Say Yes to Education. Many of you know her well from many years. She's running that now, but I first met Marianne when she was leading New American Schools, which tells you how long we've both been doing this. And she was leading New American Schools, and what I can say is she has a real knack for figuring out how to make things happen through legislation and policy and getting folks engaged across coming from lots of different places around the table. So we have a great group to reflect with you on this today. So now I have control. So we did a study, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the methodology, but I want to start with what we found. Because at Education Resource Strategies, our whole mission is to figure out how to support urban school leaders and district leaders to use their existing resources better and then move on to the next place. Because it's hard to argue for more resources if you can't make a strong case that you're doing the most that you can with the existing resources. So Citizen Schools came to us and said, help us understand how it is that schools could free existing resources. You've seen lots of studies on how you can cobble together other resources or what other funding streams need to happen. And when we did this work, we asked the question, they wanted to free it now, not in some hypothetical way, not in a charter school sort of way where you can start from scratch. If they wanted to free the resources now, how much could we free? And what we found is that most schools that we looked at, and we looked at schools in different states and different districts at different sizes and funding levels, that most schools couldn't free significant resources in the short term without three big conditions. Schools must have the flexibility and support to repurpose existing resources. And I'll talk about that a little more, as will the rest of the panel. Secondly, districts have to allocate some portion of central funds to supplement the school level reallocations. And we heard examples all morning of districts that are doing that already, taking pots of their resources and putting it in that place and concentrating those funds in the highest need schools. And then last, because schools can't free up the resources instantaneously, there is this need for additional funding in the short term to transition to these new to the new structures. If you want to implement time, you've got to free the resources, and you can't do it. You can't eliminate positions immediately. So those are our big findings. We're going to be talking a little bit more about them. I just want to put up here, I'm super hesitant about it because my whole mission is to say this is possible, right? Is to say that, we can do it with what we have. And the story is true. We can do it with what we have, but not without busting up the structures, not without putting serious political, human, and social capital at this problem to shift what's going on in our urban districts. And until we do that, we're going to be in a place where we have lots of one-off examples, either in charter schools or places where we've figured out how to do it for a short period of time or for a few schools. And so this is the moment now where we need to say, how do we put that together? What I want to talk about a little bit is what are the flexibilities needed? And then we're going to talk about some of the trade-offs. But what are the flexibilities needed? Because we tried to take it up a level. So this isn't what specific policy needs to be changed or whatever, but up a level, what kind of flexibility do we need to have? And the first is, if schools are going to make big shifts in what they're doing, this is about changing the positions that are in the school. And so in many school districts and states, you can't change positions in a school unless there's a vacancy. And so first and foremost, you wonder why this isn't happening more quickly. It's because there are real people in these schools, and there are rules that make it very difficult to change that in any sort of realistic time frame to get something big to happen. Second, we need to remove across-the-board class size maximums, because, again, that's how That's the unit that is in schools, and if we're going to free resources to do other things, we need to change up how those classes work. It doesn't mean, as Nisha will talk about later, and David will also give examples of, it doesn't mean kids are sitting in classrooms of 40 all day. It means being strategic about how you provide individual time through the combination of resources that we now have. As one of the panelists earlier today said, it's about sort of reinventing school and thinking differently about how we group students and kids. 3, we need to enable flexibility and instructor of record policies. This seems kind of obscure, but it's a huge barrier in a lot of the places that we are. So what that means is in many contracts, state legislations, and so on, there's a rule that says a certified instructor must be in the room at all times, even if there are other instructors or activities going on. So it makes it really difficult to create cost structures that work really well and to free the resources. And the last thing is there are also rules in many districts, cities, and states that prohibit folks using outside partners during the school day if it's something that someone who is employed by the school district could conceivably provide. Again, this creates all sorts of challenges for how you come up with new ways of doing things, how you introduce new partners in cost-effective ways. So those are the big 4 here, and I want to just say one more thing before moving on to our next big question here. So these flexibilities are here for a reason, and I think we should be, these rules that we need freedom from are here for a reason, and we need to respect the rules. We wanted to protect job security. We wanted to ensure kids were taken care of by people who were, had the skills, knowledge, behaviors, and were safe for kids to be with. But as we're trying to rapidly change the structures in schools and introduce innovation, we need to figure out how to respect those reasons while creating new rules and ways of working. And right now, we pay too little attention to all the ways in which we reinforce the old ways of working as we're trying to invent the new ones. So with that, I'm trying to balance this thing. It can be done, but it is a moment in time in which we need to move pretty far. And I'm going to move now to David to have him start us off on it can be done and talk a little bit about how you did create those flexibilities, how your district created those flexibilities, and then the sorts of trade-offs that you made in order to make that happen.
Yeah. Before I start, I just will say that for those of you not from New England, this is our April break month, so I'm not misspending taxpayer funds, and I'm not playing hooky from school, but I'm spending my break with you, so picture us on a beach somewhere. I was talking with Megan Bird right before lunch, who is the Massachusetts Executive Director for Citizen School. Did I say that right? No, I didn't. Regional Director for Citizen Schools. And she said, be controversial. So I will start by being controversial, which is to say that we as a school are an example of how more sometimes means less. Specifically, that more time can mean less results. So I started at the Browne Middle School 3 years ago at the last year of our state-funded expanded learning time grant. And over the course of the 5 years, our school had middling to very poor results. And the strategy the school was using up until that point was to mostly home grow our extended day. That means all of our teachers were there for 8.5 hours a day teaching. We had some contractual relationships with like a dance studio and a kickboxing teacher, but by and large, we ran an intervention period and an enrichment period entirely through our teachers. The way more meant less for us was that when you ask people who are new to the profession or people who have taught for a long time but are being now asked to meet increasingly rigorous standards, to be in front of kids for 8.5 hours a day, on top of that, plan, grade, be in touch with parents, review data, it's untenable. And the quality of instruction, the quality of planning, deteriorated as a consequence because of the extra time that we were spending. I can only speak to the anecdotal example of our school, but that was true for our school. And so in my first year, I recognized that we needed a different approach to how we would go about extending the day. Our faculty would not have voted for renewing our side agreement to the contract, and we were also at risk of losing our state expanded learning time grant. So ultimately, I reached out to citizen schools, having worked with them in the past, knowing that having some strong capacity to be able to do this work was necessary, that it could not be done with any old provider, but it needed to be done with people who had experience, back-end expertise, and knowledge. We ultimately did lose our state ELT grant. At the review at the end of the year, the report stated that teachers exited the school feeling haggard and beat up. We knew that there was value in providing more time for kids, but we had not yet realized it. So what we did was we reconceptualized for the following year how we would go about both funding and staffing our extended day. Specifically, we thought about what are the things that we are currently spending money on now that are not working. Superintendent Smith from Phoenix this morning talked about how, as a leader, you need to figure out what do you want to achieve, what are the specifics to get there, and then you go about and decide if you're going to do that or not. Our school had a multi-year history of our students struggled significantly in mathematics. And we needed some way to address the fact that about 1 in 10 of our 8th graders exited our school at grade level standard. So we figured we need to come up with a strong mathematics intervention for our kids. And we know that we cannot do this alone. So we also had a Title I funded reading interventionist who met over the course of the day with about 30 or 40 kids in our school. We knew that that was not having the results that we wanted it to see. There was no comprehensive program we were using for those purposes. So in a combination of eliminating the position, although not the person, eliminating that position, repurposing some of our SES funds, and the district putting some of the district level Title I funds as well as city resources towards the extended day, we could, for the essential price of 1.5 full-time employees, staff for 130 kids an additional 2.5 hours of learning each day. So that became, in essence, a no-brainer, right? That if we could come up with a meaningful intervention strategy by piecing together a few different resources, that was a no-brainer for us. And I think that some of the things that Karen stressed that we were able to do might not have been possible everywhere. So, for instance, the position reduction was a key factor. Having an aggressive and nimble budget office who was able to help us through this process, a superintendent who valued this and supported it, was important. We also had the benefit of not having any class size maximum, so that's not a part of our contract. And some of the ways that's played out is that our music teacher has a huge chorus that he teaches as part of our extended day. That takes about 80 of our 5th and 6th graders. And with that, there are then all kinds of interventions that are able to happen with much smaller groups of kids for kids who need it at that time. That's a key flexibility that we have. Clearly, the ability to contract with a partner that we had expedited and didn't have to go through multiple bidding processes was important. One thing that we do not have as a flexibility that does hamper our ability to use the time as well as we would like it is the instructor of record issue. So while we provide our kids over 1,300 hours of instruction throughout the year, 900 of those hours are with licensed educators employed by the Chelsea Public Schools. We would love to use some of those hours for our teachers to meet and collaborate and grow their practice. But we are required to provide 900 hours of licensed educator time for our kids. So we can't reduce the number of contact hours that our teachers have with our students, even though our kids would still be receiving, significantly more hours than would be required by state law. So those are some of the changes that we implemented.
Thank you. This is not working. So, thanks. Before I move on to the next thing, I wanted to see, David, or Marianne, do you have examples of other ways in which schools have, that build off yours, in which schools have really thought differently about how they're structuring existing resources to push even further at the kind of model of instruction? So there are ways in which, particularly your intervention strategies and that kind of thing, are changing up how we're doing school. Any thoughts here about kind of changing up how we do school to build on that?
Well, I'll just expand the conversation a little bit and hopefully spark a little bit of thinking about this. When we at Say Yes to Education, and we're an organization, we've been at this for 27 years. I joined 9 years ago to help them go from relatively modest pilot size scale to large scale, and we've converted from working with hundreds of students in different cities to working across whole cities. So 20,000 students in Syracuse, 40,000 in Buffalo, about to scale to 70,000 in Guilford County. A few big ideas is one is a big shift from thinking about identification of funding for a particular program, usually linking it to a short-term grant of some sort in the ELT space, the 21st century, SIG grants, et cetera, and making those work. The problem with that is good work gets started, but as soon as the grant goes away, the rug gets pulled out from underneath it. And this, by the way, was the huge lesson learned of New American Schools, which I was part of for 11 years before taking this job 9 years ago, is that you could put an incentive into the field and you could drive excitement and enthusiasm about becoming part of a research-based network, but during that period of time of the grant, which most of you were probably involved in some of these programs, as soon as the money went away, nobody had figured out how to continue to do that work that was making a difference. And at that point in time, difference was defined by incremental test score increases. But when we at New American Schools looked at it, one thing that was troubling to us is that while all of the programs that we supported, that we continued to support through multiple rounds of venture capital investment, they drove increases in math and reading. But when we went and looked back, we were troubled by not enough of the kids that went all the way up to and through programs actually walking the high school stage, actually matriculating to college. There was a deficiency in the way that we were thinking about this. And I mention this just to say that the work at Say Yes to Education and some of my New American Schools colleagues I've seen here really builds on that foundation. And for anybody that's in this field that wasn't involved at this point in time, sort of going back to the late 80s all the way through the 90s, there is a 10-year retrospective that the RAND Corporation wrote that really talked about the challenges and the lessons learned about how you scale evidence-based programs and how do you get to sustainability. So it's one very short read. I will not suggest that you read all $7 million of research that we had them conduct, but this piece is actually worth everybody's time. But there were a few things that have then impacted the way we've looked at approaching communities. One is that when you think about scale, part of what you need to think about, even though you're an organization that may go into a community and seek to serve 3 schools, if that's all you do, there's a really high chance that as soon as the grants run out, unfortunately, you're going to be run out of town. So as a community, extended learning time organizations need to think about how to work together and work across the strategic funding partners within a community. So when we go to a city, we bring together not only the school district and the union, but city government, county government, local philanthropy, and the community-based organizational players within a community. And a big difference is we're not building awareness and trying to get people to sign on to support the implementation of one program. we're actually getting people to mobilize around a big idea. A whole city committing to college and career readiness for every child, and defining that by all of those partners committing to children achieving a post-secondary degree as the credential that gives them access to real opportunity in life. Now, that absolutely requires that as a community, as you start to look at, so what is that pathway from kindergarten readiness to post-secondary matriculation to completion? And there's tremendous consensus in the field about that pathway. What is the type of programs that are going to drive better engagement, mitigate predictable social, health, and academic barriers to kids accomplishing that goal? And I will tell you, there is not a community I've gone into that it doesn't come around to saying kids need more time. They need more time, a longer day. They need a longer year. They need tutors and mentors and all of this stuff. But when you start the conversation from a very different place and you develop structures and data systems and a collaborative approach to really designing, delivering, and funding over the long haul this kind of work, the exciting thing is it can be sustained. And I'll give you one statistic and then I'll pass it on and hopefully say more later. Since we started in Buffalo, New York 3 years ago, we have actually had 5 superintendents. And even with that complete chaos, we now have summer programming going to scale this summer, and it's available to 100% K-12 of the students in Buffalo, New York. We have 40% of the system that has access to some type of extended learning program during the regular school year. And we have a process underway to get from 40% to 100%. It's probably going to take another 3-4 years, but it's moving in the right direction. And there are also strategies to recruit, train, and deploy volunteer networks of tutors, of mentors, utilizing partnerships with the higher ed institutions, and really looking at a holistic approach to supporting students. I'll stop with that for now.
Okay, so I love what Marianne said because it's about expanding the pie, all right? So if you remember that, the visual I had up there at the very beginning, it's about how do you both expand the pie, which our findings suggest we need to do, and how do you rearrange it, if you will? How do you change the pieces up in that pie? And so I want to come back a little bit to the, what do you do with the existing set of resources to make those trade-offs and change them around? And I'm going to pass it to Nisha for just a couple minutes to get specific about the kinds of trade-offs that we quantified, because I think it's really important when we think back to some of the things we learned about this morning about how we make this happen. It's to make it very concrete about the specific choices and trade-offs, to take it down one more level about how this can happen. And so I will, before turning it over, say that what we did here, and I'm going to ask David to comment on this in a minute, is we set a target of about $1,200 per pupil that would fund sort of 30% expansion of day for the entire school. So the example that David gave you funded just for sixth grade, and so he was able to do that in some very creative ways. The question is, what if you wanted to do that, try to do that for all your kids in a really significant way? So.
Thank you. So much of what David was saying earlier really resonated with us in doing this work, because from being in this space for the last 10 years at ERS, we know that 80% or more of school-based resources are tied up in positions. So when we're talking about sustainable funding and finding the resources at the school level to repurpose towards a targeted investment, that often does require position reductions of some sort. So in order to understand what could be possible for schools, we took 6 different typical approaches to thinking differently about the resources that you do have. And if I may, I would want to categorize these 6 into 3 larger buckets. The first being non-classroom resources, so those that are your non-instructional staff like nurses, counselors, et cetera. The second being your teachers that are working in electives or special areas classes. Changes in that space may be we have this disruptive index here, which is really not about disruption as a negative thing, but rather innovation and how much change and support would be required, both by the school and as the district, to think about professional development needs and sort of the shift that's happening to classroom instruction. And then finally, so that actually spans the 3 in the middle. And then for the last 2, we're talking about core instruction. So what's happening in your math, ELA, science, and social studies classes in your school. So within the reducing of non-instructional staff, what we found is that these 6 schools that we were profiling either had space to reduce positions that we've seen schools that we've worked with in the past reduce in order to meet the funding goals that they had, or we also looked to see what their level of staffing, so their student-teacher ratio, was relative to typical districts in our comparison database. So between those 2 things, we tried to elicit how many funds could potentially be released and repurposed towards ELT. And then, if I may, for a moment, just talk a little bit about the increased efficiency for special area subjects. What we find is that in many districts, schools are provided their positions through an allocation formula. Raise your hand if you get your positions, if you're working in a school and you have an art teacher, you have a PE teacher, and a music teacher, and that's what you get. And so particularly in small school contexts, it might be that those 4 positions that you are allocated is significantly more than what you would need to actually staff the sections that you need for your students. So you might actually only need 1.5 teachers if you could pursue part-time teachers, if you could have somebody who is dual certified, if you had some of these other flexibilities to make that possible. So that's really what we mean there. And then when we're talking about those increases to class sizes, David, your example about chorus is spot on. So we're not talking about, let's do this across the board. We're thinking, okay, where are the spaces and times within which a larger group size might be appropriate? And how does that then enable actually smaller group size? So while we're talking about increases to class size, we're actually talking about decreases to group size so that we can actually see more individual attention for students. And doing that often requires, this last row up there, a different staffing mix and the use of technology. So how do we use resident teachers and teaching assistants and technology in a new and innovative way so that we're not talking about the typical paradigm of 25 students to 1 teacher within 1 classroom, but actually a collaborative environment where all students' needs are met. And so across all of those, I think, do we want to go to the next? Yeah, so across all of those, this is what Karen was mentioning earlier, is that even if schools were to pursue so not saying that they should pursue all 6, but even if schools were to consider a strategy within which all 6 of those trade-offs were ones that they thought were applicable and smart to repurpose the funds in order to pursue something like ELT, even with full flexibility, we're talking about $500 to $1,300 on average. And that largely had to deal with the school size and the level of initial funding that those schools had on the onset. And then when we looked at what their current policy constraints are, so what they can actually do right now, the picture changes quite a bit. For some schools, it was as low as $50 per pupil available. And for some, thankfully, it's not as much of a big discrepancy there between full flexibility and what they are able to do. So again, similar to what David had, he only had 1 of the 4 constraints was actually a constraint felt. For some of the districts here, it wouldn't have been that bad depending on what's actually in their district context.
Thank you. I think it's important to emphasize this business about funding differences. In our study, the lowest funded district got about $6,000 per pupil at the school level, and the highest funded district got about 12. So that's 100% difference in funding levels, and it gets to this question of what is equity across the country, which we can talk about. So, but it's also linking to things we talked about this morning, that context matters hugely here. And if you're in a district where the spend is at the low end here, the whole choices and trade-offs are entirely different, and the advocacy is also about increasing the funding levels and thinking differently about that. So it's a very important part of the equation. And the other thing I'll add on there is that these examples, many of them, as you'll see further, actually require going outside the school to get other services outside the school day, or to bring them into the school day where you're having special subjects provided by other folks, either during or after the school day, and lots of sort of shifts, which is, again, about redefining what's the pie and what's the sandbox that you're working in. I want to go back to this question of how much does it cost, and have you talk a little bit about your research on how much it costs and how to think about that.
Thank you, and I want to thank ERS for doing this study. We did a somewhat different study, which I'm going to explain in a minute. About a year and a half ago, we released it, and as the final paragraphs stated, which all good research papers should have, further research needed. And lo and behold, ERS produced further research, so thank you. And specifically, we had highlighted this idea of school autonomy, of what flexibilities schools can have as an area for further investigation. So let me just talk about a couple of schools in our study. We studied 5 different schools, and we approached this differently than ERS. Rather than constructing sort of a theoretical model, we looked at it in reverse, and we looked at 5 schools that had expanded time and tried to understand how they funded it and where the funding was going to. So sort of real-world examples. We came out actually in a similar place, I think, to where your conclusions were. In that schools, most of them built in some flexibilities or took advantage of some flexibilities in order to get more bang for the buck. There was not a direct proportion in increased time to increased dollars, but they also relied on extra funding in order to supplement the current budget or the pre-expanded time budget in order to pull off having a longer school day, and in one case a longer school year for all students. So to your question about costs, there was a huge variety, both in, we looked at a few metrics. We looked at the per pupil cost across the district. We looked at the per pupil cost for the additional time, and we looked at the per pupil cost per hour. And there, on all 3 metrics, a huge range. 2 schools in particular I wanted to bring out because I think they speak to larger themes. One is in Elizabeth, New Jersey, called the Adria Academy. And it actually started sort of as a, it started out, it was formed in 1998, or created in 1998 as sort of an in-district magnet school. And they started out with a much longer year, about 20 days longer, and a much longer day. But it started from scratch, and the students, all the students who applied to attend, and all the teachers who were going to work there knew that that's the way it was going to be. That school, what's interesting about that school and that district really is that that school became a model to lead the entire district over time, and there's a sort of a complicated history there, but really the whole district took expanded time. So now the entire district has a longer school day, not a longer school year, but a longer school day. And it was that school that sort of served as the cost model that the district built upon. The second one was in Colorado, called the McGlone Elementary School, and that is an innovation school. Colorado is one of the states that allows individual schools to apply to the state for what's called innovation status, and allows them a lot more flexibility to restructure their budget and use their budget in different ways than they would if they were a traditional district school. And that allowed them, this particular school, to free up about $200,000 a year that they then put towards a specific reading intervention program. Then they, on top of that, they had additional private money that was raised in order to support teachers working longer and additional interventions. But they needed that innovation in order to sort of get, to sort of start the process.
So, sorry. So building on that a little bit, I want to push on this question of, so how, if we need to get to this innovation, what is it we need to begin to do to get this to happen more at scale. But going back to what's the case we need to build that lets people take the risk that's required here to let more schools have this flexibility? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So I think a big piece of it is how you really mobilize the entire community. I think the idea of having a big breakthrough goal is absolutely critical. You're not mobilized, you're not getting people out in rallies and excited, and in weekend activities with lots of kids around, we're going to increase reading scores by 10%. But when you start to talk within communities that truly commit to this concept of a post-secondary degree for every child, and you have political leadership standing with educational and social and community-based organizational leadership saying, we can do it, and we're going to fundamentally change the way we do business to do it, you can start to move it. We have found that there are a few things. One is the commitment to a goal that requires that everybody gets, that if we continue to do everything we've been doing in the past and just get this incremental stuff, we're never going to get close to that goal. So it sort of breaks open thinking. The second, there needs to be a powerful incentive that withstands the predictable political transition of leadership in every position that we have to work with. The incentive we came up with as an organization is to create the capacity in a community to offer a full tuition scholarship to college to every child that is a public school student. And I can't get into all the details, but we've created a compact of private colleges that are part of this movement of access and success, particularly for underrepresented youth. And then we've also organized within local communities, particularly the corporate sector, to put a capital base together to provide last dollar scholarships to any public university within a state. And the per child cost of that is not that large because such a large percentage of the population is eligible for Pell and state financial aid. But that allows you to have a different conversation because many kids that are eligible for it aren't thinking about it and aren't even taking the steps to be positioned to do it. So this powerful incentive rallies people to commit to do business differently. The other piece, and I'll just be perfectly honest, it was after I was in Washington for 18 years, I got back out into the field and realized that so much of the top-down mandates, the federal government's not going to solve this for us. There really has to be this bottom-up piece that meets in the middle with the federal and state, and part of how we've done that is when we went to a community and we had a competitive process to pick a city, we said there are some assets that we'll bring to the community. We are a foundation. We brought a grant. The amount of money that was compared to what's spent in a local community is nothing. But it was a big enough number, just like the idea of comprehensive school reform, with those, on average, $68,000 grants for schools was enough to get schools to say, hey, I will look at internationally benchmarked best practice. This idea of putting a $15 million grant in front of a city has had that kind of catalytic effect. But what the non-negotiables are is that they commit to something we refer to as collaborative governance, sitting at a common table. You hear some of this around collective impact, but it is having the mayor's office, the county office, the school system, local philanthropy, corporate, higher ed, faith-based, parent groups, all sitting at a common table, literally meeting every 2 weeks, planning and then implementing programs. They commit to a common data platform, which, believe it or not, you can get people to rally around. And I would say the biggest thing I would note about that is that it's not just a data system for external accountability. It becomes a tool for coordination of program service delivery and a tool to be able to learn what's working, what isn't. Not in a gotcha kind of way, but in a continuous improvement type of way. And we've been able to drive strategic reallocation of millions of dollars by having independent individuals analyze how every dollar, every staffing position, similar to the ERS work, but moving beyond just a school district's instructional budget, the entire budget. And then not just that, critical parts of city budgets, county budgets that allow you to identify and then take to scale a set of academic, social, and health programs that are driving increases, high school completion up 8 percentage points in 3 years, 9% increase in college matriculation, which starts to build a momentum around continuing to do this. The big piece of it is it does require everybody to give up some of their siloed positional power. Certain decisions that a mayor used to make behind closed door or a school board would make behind closed door, it can't happen that way because they're committing to work in a very different way. And if you have a leadership transition and somebody wants to back out or go back to old practices, the nice thing about this, it's the community leadership that stands up and speaks up to say you can't do that, because if you do, this incentive that our city has of full tuition scholarships, that goes away. So carrots and sticks, incentives, strategic analytics to look at dollars, to look at quality or lack thereof in programming, and then really to do budget development based on a real understanding of where you want kids to get to, exactly where they are now, because we also help to do pathway analytics that looks at every single child and then puts it into a system that allows you to focus on individual growth and success at the individual level, at scaled school level, system-wide, et cetera. So it's a big change in the way business is done, but it's actually happening, and it's leading to things I think some of you wouldn't expect to have happen, like having scaled summer school or having a mental health clinic in every single public school building across the city of Buffalo. These types of shifts can happen when people become mobilized and focused and supported through a very structured process around these types of outcomes and objectives.
So I want to open it to questions in the audience about, for any of us, and I can kind of direct them as well.
My name is Andrea Archer, and while we're on you, can you talk a little bit more about the magic that really happened to realize what you said about that collaboration? Because I know it's a lot harder than that.
Yeah.
I think one piece of it is thinking about how you even begin the process. So we had a very detailed request for proposal. That process takes about a year to actually create the conditions to launch this type of work, and it's time really, really well spent. It articulates a set of conditions that actually create the capacity within the community to provide very practical programs that we all know kids, particularly in urban concentrated poverty, need. And it provides a 5-year window with some supports along the way to really identify where the resources are, figure out a plan to allocate them against the strategic programming, and to build muscle within a community to actually plan, act, and continuously improve together. You need to invest, though, in having staff full-time that play the facilitation, that glue. And for example, we put a site facilitator in every public school building. We don't pay for them. County government can pay 2/3 of it. We've worked with city mayors to provide the match. So there are innovative ways to get that kind of, that glue person that creates the link between school day programming and wraparound supports. And a similar type of function needs to be created in the umbrella over all of the different systems. And the incentives is what gets the different parts of government and the private sector excited about being part of this type of effort.
I just want to sort of dovetail on what you said in that and you point out in your report that the financial incentives are key to jump-starting, but it's not enough. There are many, many hundreds of examples, and probably thousands of examples, where there's money available for expanded time, but it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen in an effective way because the leadership isn't there, the buy-in isn't there. And so it's money plus. And I think we learned that over and over, and I think that's certainly the schools, the 5 schools we studied in this particular report, but really in a much broader way. I mean, the best example out there, I think, to demonstrate this is the school improvement grant, where there are thousands of schools funded by the federal government for school improvement. A requirement is to increase learning time. But that increased learning time is not always used in the best ways. It's not always for all students. It's often used in a sort of a remedial way rather than a school redesign, which is its intention. And so the leadership piece, the pure human will is just so important.
One of the big points I wanted to bring out and haven't had a way to do, so you're giving it to me, is that right now most of our funding systems still don't adjust all that much for student need, right? We have ESEA that puts extra dollars in there, but the amount of dollars that go in there is a fraction of what's needed, particularly in schools that have 75–80% of students that are struggling in some way with learning. And one of the keys to sustainable funding is figuring out a way, particularly as we move on to the secondary school levels, figuring out a way to sustainably adjust for student need for the schools that are serving the highest concentrations of those. And you see that happening at the state level with California moving toward really, having a higher weight for concentration. You see that happening in a number of districts like Boston, like New York, like Baltimore City, where students who are way behind get additional dollars in the schools when they move into a new school, so that the school can do that without having the school improvement grant come along 4 years after. Sure enough, the kids are still 3 years behind when that's where they started. So really thinking about those funding structures that sustain them is a really highly leveraged endeavor, both at the state and the local level. Right here? I've got 5 minutes. Okay, so we'll try to get through as many as we can with quick answers, and then.
Hi, my name is Scott Lippman. I'm with Tenacity in Boston. The question for David: one of the amazing things that's listed in your bio is the impact that your partnership with Citizen Schools has had on suspensions and decreasing the suspension rate dramatically in your school. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the role that partners have played in the professional culture of your school.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I want to say two things. One is that the goal that we have through our partnership is to very concretely affect the extent to which students master grade level content, right? And that is a goal that we track and we measure and we report out on. And then we also have equally important goals that go beyond the academic goal. I do want to say that that's an important goal that I'm going to try to be controversial too, that I hear that 10 percentage points of reading gains is not always translated into increased high school graduations, but for a partner organization to be a strong partner with schools, when we're held accountable for those kinds of results, that has to be foremost in any partnership that we establish, is that they share the primary goals to which we are held accountable. But to answer your question, there are equally important goals that we have around changing kids' orientations towards what is possible, towards their experience in school. And one of the real benefits of our partnership with Citizen Schools is that we have a group of 22, 23, 24-year-olds who are in our school who in some senses are almost near peers to many of our students, who have more time in their day to sit with students, to talk with them, to have informal relationships with them. That's often difficult for the adults in our building who are responsible at all times throughout the day of a particular task or a particular responsibility. So that infusion of extra just human resource time allows us to, there are students, for instance, who have built in to their days movement breaks, cool-off passes. We have one guidance counselor and social worker for 580 students. So, that's not, that's obviously a core part of her responsibility, but she can't manage that with all the kids in our school. So to have additional adults in our building who can just take a kid on a walk around the building when they're about to have a blow up in class, that's a resource that is huge to us, and it makes a big difference. Knowing we're short on time, and I kick myself if I didn't say this, one thing that I think is really important, Professor Summers talked earlier this morning about the widening gap between what families from the top fifth of the income distribution and the bottom fifth of the income distribution spend on their out-of-school educational opportunities. And the interesting thing about that statistic, and I talk about this a lot, is that even with families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, which is almost all of the kids in our school, they are still spending over $1,300 a year on their kids' out-of-school educational time. it is breathtaking and stunning to me, and is reflective of the importance that our families place and trust that they place in our school to do work on behalf of their kids. So if families who make on average about $25,000 a year can spend $1,300 of that to their child's out-of-school educational time, it's inconceivable to me that we as a society can't think of a way to come up with about that same amount of money in public and private and foundation funding to do the same things. And I think that's the last thing I want to say. And you know, that's the last thing I want to say is just that in our experience, ELT on the cheap doesn't work. That doing it at low cost, we found is ineffective. And so having a strong partner with some serious back-end support is critical.
And why don't we end it right there where it should be? So do you want to next steps here?